as quilters, we get so excited when we start a new quilt and pull the pattern together with the fabrics and decide how it's all going to look and lay out and what the design elements will be and getting just the right colors in the right places. And then we start to think, oh, what else can I do? Maybe I can change this up a bit and really enhance this design. And those words kind of start creeping in. On point quilts. Oh my gosh, why would we want to do that? That's so complicated. There's math involved and there's triangles and you have to cut blocks and you have to do this and oh my goodness, what if we get the bias on the wrong edge? And we step back, we completely drop the idea and we make our same old quilt that we were going to from the beginning, and we potentially are missing out on a real beauty. Well, I'm Leah Louise from Inspired Quilting by Leah Louise, and I want to talk to you about on-point quilts. I've been there, I've done that, but I have found a way that works really well for me. It may not be for everybody. As a matter of fact, I know it's not for everybody. I'm kind of a nonconformist, and I don't like all the formulas, all the math, all the fussing with this and that, and there's even a way you can do your setting triangles by using 3 rulers at once. Now, I don't know about you, but I have a hard enough time holding the ruler with one hand and cutting with the other. I don't know what I'd do with 2 more rulers. And then we have to cut our blocks in a certain way, and we have to put them in a certain place. And if we don't, the quilt's not going to work right. And then we get back to those bias edges. What are we going to do? So we're spinning around in circles over this silly nonsense that's quite silly. It's not that bad. It's not even that difficult. And I'm going to show you how we're going to do this. You're going to like this. You're going to enjoy this. And I think you may even want to try this. So what I've done is I took the quilt we made last week. Actually, it was just a few days ago. Remember that pretty pink quilt? And it's offset, or excuse me, it's alternating squares between the 9 patch and the 4 patch. I have it hanging up here behind me. And it was just a small little baby quilt that measured about 40 inches. And when I was making it, I told you, oh, I'm going to have to make this bigger. There needs to be more to this because I really love the fabrics. Well, what I decided to do is make it on point. To set it on point is what it's actually called. And what we do is we turn those blocks a quarter turn so that the block itself, instead of a square sitting on its flat edge, now sits on a point. And that's why it's called on point. And it just adds a totally different dimension, and the blocks look different the way they fit together. But I'll tell you, we still sew a row from end to end in the same manner. That doesn't change. We just put a triangle on each end, and that's okay. We can do that. And then we go ahead and sew those rows together, and instead of having them all actually hitting on the same edge, they're offset a bit, and that's where the triangle fits in to fill the gap. Now, the big complication with the math is what size do we use? And I'll tell you, I am challenged in this area. I once had like a 6 or 7 inch block, and I had to figure out, how am I going to put a square in a square? And I needed those 4 triangles that are going to go around the block. I could not figure out for the life of me what I was going to do, how to figure it out. Now, I know math, I know algebra, I took geometry, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, our hypotenuse. But, you know, I'm working with a quilt here. What's that got to do with this? It just wasn't clicking. So I got out my trusty paper bag and scissors, and I cut a block, and I cut the triangles in different sizes to make it work, and I figured it out. So I kind of learned that it's not always about the math. It can be very visual, and being a visual learner, that's really important to me. You can give me all the numbers in the world, and unless I understand that application, it's not going to work. And I'm sure there's some of you out there that are the same way. So what I'm going to do is show you what works for me, and I'm hoping that that's going to give you a little more insight into making an on-point quilt. Now, this method won't always work for every quilt you want to put on point. It works particularly well here because it's a 9-block quilt, and it's very easy to turn it into an on-point quilt. I thought I was going to have to take it apart and repiece it in order to get my on-point setting. And then I looked at it and I said, wait a minute. And I got my paper and pencil and said, I have a solution. I know how I need to do this. And all I had to do was make a few more blocks, place them correctly, and add my triangles. And there you are. I have this great quilt. So I'm so excited to show you. It's hanging here behind me. And if you can see that outer edge, you notice that it looks a little different than it did before. So I'm going to show you some different views of this quilt and show you how to put it together. And I'm really, really excited to get started. So let's go. I'm ready to quilt. Oh, and please, if you'd subscribe, I'd really appreciate it, and give me a thumbs up. I'm so glad you're here today. Let's talk about quilts. I was so excited when I first used these fabrics in the last video to make a quilt that I wanted to make another or make it bigger or do something because I just love these fabrics. And the previous quilt was a baby size quilt that measures about 40 inches. And it's an alternating 9-patch and 4-patch block, and it works out really well and creates some great diagonals. I'll put the link up above if you didn't get to see that one. But what I wanted to do is perhaps make it bigger. I wanted to do more with it. And just adding another row of blocks just wasn't enough. So I thought about it and decided what I need to do is put this quilt on point. And it would just be beautiful because this background is wonderful, and to have that around the edges and the quilt be set on point would be fantastic. Now, not everybody's done that, and as quilters, sometimes hearing on point sends a chill down our spine because we're talking about math and calculations and triangles and bias edges and all those key words that tend to put us on the edge of our chair going, oh, do I want to do this? Do I want to tackle it? What's it going to be? Am I going to have a problem? I figured out something absolutely fantastic. So let me just show you real quick what my plan is. So here's a basic picture of the quilt that we made. And as you recall, it's a 9-patch. So we have 9 different quilts, 9 different blocks just like this, okay? Now, to make this into a quilt that is set on point, what we need to do is put these corners as the sides. How do I say that? We're going to switch these corner pieces into becoming side pieces, which means what I need to do is create a couple more blocks in each corner. This is one of those, laying in bed thinking, how is this going to go together? There's got to be an easy way. At first I thought, oh, I'm going to have to take the quilt apart. And I'm going, oh, no, no, no. So all we need are 4 extra 9-patches, just like this here. And then, watch this, it's like magic. I just think this is so cool. We add our side setting triangles, and look at that. We add a corner in each of these spots, and now we have a square quilt on point. So when we look at this quilt up and down from top to bottom, these become a diamond shape. Obviously there's still a square, but they're on point. And that's the difference with what an on-point quilt is. Now the trickiest part to this is figuring out this size triangle. But that's not difficult here. All we need to know is this dimension from corner to corner. And our blocks are already made. We can figure that out easily. I am going to show you the easiest way to turn a square quilt into an on-point layout. You're going to love this. So let me make some room here and we're going to get started, and I'm going to show you how this is going to work. So as I showed you in the diagram, the first thing we need to do is make 4 more 9-patch blocks. And in case you haven't seen that, we're just going to do a quick review. We put our 9 patches laid out. 5 of them are in our focal, 4 are in our background, and then we sew them into 3 strips like this. So each of these are chain stitched into three separate rows. Now I'm going to take these and sew these rows together. So you see how these three come together, and notice we're nesting those seams so we get really good corners. So we do the first one. Let me grab this here, and I'm going to put that here, sew that seam. And now I'm going to take this one over, sew that seam. What I want to show you is that I press these seams in opposite directions. So these go this way and this comes this way. It doesn't matter which way, because these blocks are not going to line up with matching seams to another block. So whatever works for you is fine. The important part is that these are pressed in opposing directions so that we can get good nesting seams. Then once the quilt block is sewn together completely, we want to press these in a single direction. And with that done, we have a beautiful finished 9 patch, and this is going to be the quilt that we're working with. So what we're going to do from here now is create the triangles that will go on each side, as well as the triangle that'll create our point. And I've got plenty of my background fabric. Thankfully, I have enough that I can go ahead and do this. Otherwise, I'd have gone for a quick run to the quilt shop or online trying to find more. So let me go ahead and show you how this is going to go together. But one quick thing too, while we're at this, since we're talking about on-point quilts, many of you have already downloaded my All Blocked In pattern. It's a free pattern. It's one that it's the first pattern I designed probably about maybe 3 years ago, I think it's been. And I know there have been a couple thousand copies of it downloaded. And it comes, the pattern itself is in 4 different layouts, and one of them is an on point. So I wanted to bring that to your attention. So if you've already downloaded this, then this might be a good reference for you if you've not done an on-point quilt before, because this lays out the basics and gives you a good background of how this goes together and how we work out those dimensions. Because I don't do any math in this one either. It's a similar method of just figuring out the size I need, add some seam allowance, and go from there. And it really is okay to do it that way. We can go through all the math and all the calculations, but sometimes I find that it almost comes a little too close, and when I go to trim, I might not have enough. So I'd rather have a little extra on the outside edges to work with than to cut things too close. So this is my method, and this has worked for me. And like I said, I did this the first time 3 years ago, and it worked out fantastic, and I've been doing it ever since. So this pattern's available. It's free of charge. I'll put the link down below. If you already have it, just take a look. This is the 4th quilt in this particular series, and it has some really good information. So let me go ahead and get all the details for the sizes of this, and we're going to start cutting, and we're going to get our background squares cut so that we can make our side setting triangles and our corner triangles, and we're going to have a finished quilt. We have our 4 patches made so that we have these 4 blocks ready to go. The only thing we need now are these corner diagonals. Let me do it here so you can see the corner diagonal triangles that are going to go right there. And then we'll do the corners, but we'll do the corners last. We're going to work on these right here. So we have a 13.5-inch block. That's what it finishes at. And we need to make this block fit along the 13.5. Now it makes sense that you would just cut a 13.5-inch square, but it doesn't quite work that way because we have this diagonal line and we need, or the diagonal cut in our fabric, and we need to add our seam allowance. So I want to show you an example of what I'm talking about. When all else fails, get a paper bag and make a pattern, right? So here we have a block. I cut a square that's approximately 14 inches, you know, using the yucky scissors, the kitchen scissors. Don't use the good ones on your paper bags. And a 14-inch square like this is going to fit perfectly with your block because it's going to finish at 13.5, but at this point it's at 14. Now what's going to happen is that this block, this triangle, is going to fit right here. But what I want you to see is if I cut this right at the 14 inches, see what happens when I line this up right there? I don't have enough for seam allowance. So let's say I put this right here and I go to sew this. There's not enough seam allowance there to give me what I need to get the second block attached. So we need to go with a larger square. And in order to do that, like I said, there are these calculations you can do and numbers that you call a constant. You multiply, sometimes you add it, you add a seam allowance, and it just is all more than I care to get into. So I kind of use the basic method and say, let me start with a block and see what I need. So I know that a 14 inch isn't big enough. So I need to add a seam allowance, enough on each side, and I want to add enough that's going to give me some room to trim my quilt after the fact and not lose any of my corners. So I probably am adding more than necessary. You can certainly do less than this, but it works for me, and I like to have plenty of fudge factor room. So I cut another block at 15.5 inches. What I want to show you is when I cut it diagonally and piece it here, I've got plenty for my seam allowance, because when this is attached like this, so this corner lines up here, we come over here, I'm going to take my 1/4 inch seam allowance. I still have a good, I don't know, 1/2 to 5/8 inch there that's going to allow me then to fold that out and sew in the other direction. So that's the size I'm going to go with. And my rule of thumb is usually anywhere from 1.5 to 2 inches. It depends. The bigger the block, sometimes you need to go a little more. If you have any question with it whatsoever, then go to the paper method. You can also use the charts. I just wanted to show you how I do it because I find it so much easier. And it just depends on how you deal with math, how you deal with patterns, how you deal with angles and things of that nature. And we all have a different way of working through it. And sometimes if we see a different way, it sort of makes something click that we can better understand the process. So now that I know the size of the squares that I need to cut to get my triangles for the edges, we're going to go ahead and get that done, and this quilt's going to be finished before you know it. And here's my 15.5 inch square. So I'm ready to go ahead and make my side triangles. Side setting triangles is what they're called. And unfortunately you can't see this that far away, but I drew a line. See right there? Oh my goodness, this is really hard to see. So there's a line in the center, and I sewed on each side of it by about 1/8 of an inch. And that stitching is going to keep the fabric from stretching, because remember, when we cut on the diagonal of the fabric, it'll tend to stretch. Now it doesn't stretch from side to side, but when you go diagonally it will. But you'll notice when I sew it, I don't get that pull like I do right here. So this stitching, it's stay stitching is what I call it. When you're sewing garments, clothing, things like that, that's what this is called. It's a very common practice to reinforce seams that are maybe either on a curve or is going to involve a bias. So I just incorporate that into this project, and it works very well. So I'm going to cut it right on the line. And as I said, I sewed about 1/8 of an inch away from the line on each side. And that's just going to secure that cut so that it won't stretch on me while I'm working on this. So now I have 2 triangles, and they're ready to go. This part that I did my stitching on, actually I think you can see it better on this side. Can you see it there? I promise there's stitching along that edge, right in there. And that is going to hold everything in place while we get this quilt finished up. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to use our block, and the way this is going to look is we're going to put a triangle on each side. So I have the first one already sewn. I put it in place with a 1/4 inch seam, and you'll see, actually let me pull this down a little bit, and you'll see right here that I have that little extra bit to work with up there. Now we generally need at least a 3/8 inch, which is almost a 1/2 inch, to accommodate the triangle's point. So when the piece is caught, you know, it's what they call the dog ear, that piece that sticks out. So we have that, plus I have a little extra. And that just always makes me feel better because then I know I have exactly what I need. So this will be my first side, and then I'm going to take a second triangle and sew it this way, so that when this opens up, I'm going to have this almost pyramid. And then this is where my corner is going to go up here to finish off the block. So I'm going to sew here and attach this to the quilt, and that's what I want to show you next, because I have a piece here already put together, and I want to show you. You'll get a better idea when I do a full shot of this, but for right now I just want to get this in the camera so that this is where my straight side is. My original quilt ends right here. There's 1, 2, and 3 blocks. And then what I've done is I've added the extra block with 2 triangles. So that's going to enlarge my quilt considerably. This is what we call the side setting corner, or excuse me, the side setting triangle. And then we're going to add our corner triangle to square this off. So we'll get that going there. And that's essentially all there is to it. So it's just a fun way. If you have a small quilt pattern that you love, maybe it's a baby quilt or a lap quilt, and it's a square, this works great on a square. If you have a rectangle, you want to look at that all blocked in pattern because that's a rectangle, and the corners work a little bit different because they don't exactly end the same way. Sometimes you can get different sized triangles depending on how many rows you have. So I know there's a lot of information to think about and to look at, but this really is quite simple. And the fact that you can put together your small quilt first and then just add these corner pieces, oh my goodness, that just makes it so easy. And I think it's a lot of fun. It's a different way to do it. It comes out great. It works wonderfully. And I'm really happy with it. So let me go ahead and get this finished, and I'm going to show you what it looks like. Now with all our side setting triangles in place, we only have our corners. We have 4 corners that we need to do. And we're going to follow basically the same process. We're going to cut 2 squares with a diagonal cut to give us our 4 corners. Now we're going to figure the same way for this as we did our other blocks, and we're going to look at how wide this measures. So we know this is a 13.5 inch. It's cut at 14 right now, so there's our 14 inch, but I want to cover this full amount, so that's 15 inches from side to side. Now this is going to be a block that's going to be cut. Wrap this around here this way in order to get our square. So this part of our block needs to measure 15 inches. We have to figure out what that dimension is going to be. So this is really a quick way to do it. On my ruler, I've got my 15 inches from here to right here. And I am going to follow this diagonal line from the bottom of my grid. Let's see, you can't quite see, there we go. From the bottom of my grid along the 45 degree now, Make sure we get on the right line. And I'm going to go up to 15 inches. Right, actually I'm going to 15.5. So right here, see that point right there? And that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Is that what it is? Too many, they get those small ones and I can't figure it out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It's actually 11 inches. So if we cut this at 11, and I'm telling you, I'm going to go to 12 just because I want that extra flexibility. Because if my corner is off just a little bit, it's going to be difficult to square my quilt. If I have the extra fabric, it's going to go much easier. So I'm going to cut a 12-inch square. So I have a 14. This is the one I didn't use before. And I am going to cut this to 12 inches. So there's 10. And I can see there's 12 inches there. And what about here? I've got 12 inches here. So I'm just going to draw a line from there to there. And I'm going to cut that. Now, if you don't want to use paper, I've used muslin before. When I'm what do I want to say? When I'm gauging sizes, when I'm measuring something that I've not done before, I like to do it with a sample just to make sure I'm on the right track and I don't waste a lot of fabric. So if I have either some scrap fabric, piece of muslin, but the paper bag works great for me. So here I am. I have a 12-inch square. Is that, yep, right on the 12-inch line. And it's cut at the diagonal from corner to corner. So the way this is going to work is this block then gets placed right here. And look at that. We have just enough hanging out each edge so that when we flip this up, we have our corner and our quilt is complete. We now have a full square of squares set on point. So I'm going to whip this up really quick. I'm going to cut some 12. What did I say? See, I'm already getting myself confused. That's why I have to keep writing it down. 12 inches. So I need to do my 12-inch squares. I'll make two 12-inch squares that I'll cut. Then I'll draw the line, sew an 1/8 inch on either side, cut them in half, and put them on my quilt. And then that's going to be finished. We're practically there. All right, it's a home stretch. Give me just a minute. I'll get that all finished. And that 12-inch square was just the right size. Look at how well that fits in the corner. Couple things. When I cut it in half, that bias edge, the stretchy edge, is going to be along this quilt edge, the edge of the block. So doing the stitching an 1/8 inch on either side of that cut is optional. If you don't do it, what I do recommend is that you sew from this side with this fabric to the bottom because it's going to be less apt to stretch. You want to find the center of this triangle and the center of this block. You can see I just folded it over and made a crease. Line that up and then pin each end and sew across. And like I said, I sewed from this side so I didn't have any problems with the triangle stretching on me. But that's it. So what's fun to see, and you'll be able to see this better when I get a full shot of the quilt hanging up, is we now have these side triangles. So we have our corner that feeds into the side triangle, a second side triangle, and all the way down to the other corner. So I'm kind of curious to see what this measures. I'll do it after and I'll put it down in the notes because that's kind of messy to try and do that now. What I do want to show you, I'm not going to trim this. When I get ready to quilt it, I'm going to quilt it just as it is. I'm not going to do anything about these edges. But once it's quilted and I get ready to do my trimming in order to cut everything back and get the binding ready, I will use a long ruler and measure 1/4 inch away from those points. Now, I want to have my seam allowance 1/4 inch away so that when I sew, I'm going to not cut these points off. I want to make sure those points remain on the quilt edge. So what I will probably do is cut this just a generous edge, a generous seam allowance. So it'll be 1/4 inch plus a smidge. And then that way, when I'm sewing across the back, when I sew right along here, I'll come right on this side of that point. And then when I turn that over, my point's going to remain perfect just where it needs to be. This is just like doing half square triangles. If you've seen those tutorials, that's the same way I do that. Or the flying geese in order to protect those points. It's about adjusting your seam allowance just a little bit in order to make sure those points remain. So that's it. This is wonderful. I'm just really excited about how it turned out. Be sure and check the description below because I'm going to have a tutorial for this as far as the 9 squares and making the quilt itself with all the dimensions I used. So I don't want you to miss any of that. And it's all freebie stuff that you can download. So make sure you check it out. And let me get an overhead shot, a full quilt shot that I can show you here, and then we'll be finished. I appreciate you being here. This has been a fun quilt to work on. And here's the finished quilt, looking beautiful. I think it turned out great. And you see how these side-setting triangles fit right in between there and put everything on point, so we have this diagonal. Ordinarily, this was our original quilt right here, this square in between. So these were our corners, and it was just this little bit of a box. But then we added these larger corners and created a larger quilt and a more interesting quilt. I like the way the pattern falls on this, and it's because it's set with the extra blocks, and I think it just fits in really, really well. And I'm excited about it. Now, it's definitely going to need a border. So that will be my next step. And my very first thought in looking at this is continuing something on each side with these squares that are coming through, because these lines of squares that are going up, down, and each way really kind of draw you out. And I think I want to use some of these prints in the border. So I don't know. I've got some ideas brewing, and we'll see where it all leads. But I really, really like the way the quilt turned out, and I'm excited. I hope I didn't scare you away from doing an on-point quilt. I probably talked a lot more about it than I needed to, but there's just a lot of things that come to mind when I'm working on it. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. It's always such a pleasure to have you join me. Thanks so much for being here. I'll see you again soon.